And we're starting panel number 3 on how can we promote a gender-transformative approach to fighting stereotypes, prejudices, and discrimination. We are going to have a dear friend, Stephanie Boyce, as moderating the panel from the Law Society. And I'm so pleased to welcome here on the stage our dear Trisha Shetty, who is the CEO of She Says. She's my boss also, because she is the chair of the steering committee of the Paris Peace Forum. And so we're so glad to have you here on site. But we will also have a set of speakers and discussants of this panel that I really want to welcome them. We're going to be looking at the cross-cutting issue of gender. We have been discussing how much our societies are reproducing biases, stereotypes, mindsets that are leaving many people behind. And we know how hard COVID has put on these issues of discrimination and racism core to the agenda. As we recognize the central role of women fighting the pandemic, we also first and foremost acknowledge and address the persisting and deepening gender inequalities and stereotyping in our societies that now have translated into the COVID pandemic and the impact it has had on women, which has been really non-proportionate. We know that women make 70% of the global healthcare workforce and paid care industry, almost 60% of primary education teachers, more than 2/3 of the staff at grocery stores checkout, the essential workers, those that kept the economy, the society, our world moving during the pandemic were women. But these jobs are really low pay, low quality conditions, and are highly exposed. So when we talk about women and the COVID pandemic, we really need to realize that they are in the scale of the society in a position that is really weak. At home, unpaid work has increased disproportionately due to homeschooling and the need to replace care and other services closed by the pandemic. And this despite the fact that women already spend 3 times more hours than men on this. So there is some change to be done. Access to quality health and reproductive services, education, social protection, and digital technologies also have been made harder for women and girls. Hatred, racism, and violence have skyrocketed and have gender-based discrimination, intimate partner violence, cyberbullying, and harassment against women or girls. Everybody suffers, but women and girls suffer more. In times of quarantine and social isolation, women and girls found themselves confined with their abusers. The UN estimates that domestic violence rose by up to 50% in certain places. And then the use of new technologies. This vastly accelerated, but not all for better. Many women remain excluded from these spaces, from access to personal smartphones, to ICT education, to leadership positions of STEM and AI. As with everything, all of these got worse with COVID, and therefore the COVID recovery needs to be gender-friendly and needs to have a gender agenda core to the packages that member states will pull together. They need to be at the center stage. Members need to legislate equality and to adopt truly inclusive practices and policies to address gender biases, prejudices, and stereotypes. They need to commit to supporting women and girls in their ambitions on education, on economic empowerment, on access to markets, to take fair action on equal pay, representation, and access to all professions, including through affirmative action and economic incentives, to develop frameworks to redress cultural and social norms that belittle women's leadership and place all domestic and child-rearing responsibilities on women. Nothing wrong with that. I'm a mom and very happy to take care of my children, but we need some better fair sharing of the burden of household. This is why our initiatives promote positive redefinitions of gender norms, engage men and boys as proactive agents of change, and foster the empowerment and leadership of women and girls in all spheres of societies, and in particular in decision-making. One example is the upcoming launch of our Global Observatory of Women in Sports with the support of the Swiss government. Another one is UNESCO participation in the Action Coalition of Technology and Innovation for Gender Equality of the Generation Equality Forum, in line with our recommendation on ethics of artificial intelligence to fight bias and stereotypes. And in June, in this space, I hope that we will be open, at the second event of the Generation Equality Forum in Paris, UNESCO will join UN Women and France to discuss how to address the needs of young women. And we will also launch a network of women role models and leaders who empower, support, inspire, and encourage women and younger generations by leading of example. The success of women leaders in their handling of the COVID-19 is a proof that women can and should break the glass ceiling and deserve their seats in the highest level of decision-making. So I welcome your joining us in these efforts. The COVID recovery will be as solid as it is by integrating women concerns and this gender-friendly agenda. So I now give the floor to Stephanie Boyce, President of the Law Society, who actually recently published a brilliant toolkit to support women lawyers and fight gender-based discrimination in the law. What a topic, Stephanie. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Gabriela, for those thoughtful insights that will guide us around the world. So good afternoon, good morning, or good evening from wherever you are joining us in the world. My name is Stephanie Boyce, and I'm the new president of the Law Society of England and Wales. And I will be moderating, the moderator for this third panel of this day-long event. That is the UNESCO Global Forum Against Racism and Discrimination. I'm delighted to be joining you all today for this event. I'm somewhat atypical for a Law Society office holder. I was the first Black office holder, the second in-house solicitor, and as of last Friday, I am the first person of colour to hold the position of president. I hope to bring a fresh perspective, an understanding of the experiences of underrepresented groups and what we must all do to support them. I also hope that through my experience and that of many others, to provide proof that no matter what the challenge or how insurmountable the odds appear to be, it is possible to succeed if you are determined and passionate. So let me first remind everyone that interpretation is in 6 languages and is available in English, French, Spanish, Chinese, Arabic, and Russian. You will find the interpretation channels on the bottom right of your screen. If you do not, I suggest that you download the latest version of Zoom. We invite you to use the Q&A tab to share your comments, questions, and suggestions with us. We cannot assure you that we will have the time to answer all of them, but they will be taken into consideration in the building of UNESCO's anti-racism and anti-discrimination roadmap. For all of you on social media, please use the hashtag #FulfillTheDream and #FightRacism and tag us at UNESCO on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. In this panel, our distinguished speakers will seek to answer the question: how can we promote a gender-transformative approach to fighting stereotypes, prejudice, and discriminations? In the current context of the COVID-19 pandemic, which has disproportionately impacted the lives of women and girls, it is of crucial importance that we focus on how racism intersects with gender-based discrimination and violence. For instance, in my own sector, it is clear we have further to go to achieve international gender and racial equality for women in the law. To mark this year's International Women's Day, the Law Society created a toolkit to support female legal professionals. As part of this project, we conducted a survey of over 3,000 women from across 6 continents. Our results indicate that women in law still face significant barriers to progression, including unconscious bias, unequal pay, a lack of support when speaking out about instances of sexual harassment in the workplace, and the double burden women face when juggling caring responsibilities and work commitments. Our respondents also discussed how other forms of discrimination, including racism, compounded their difficulties. They noted an absence of support to minority ethnic groups, and in some instances spoke of the challenges they faced addressing intersectionality when setting up organisations for female lawyers. One of my objectives as president will be to encourage our members to adopt policies that tackle gender and racial inequality to help create a more diverse, inclusive, and representative profession. So our panelists will share their complementary and multidisciplinary expertise and experience to help us comprehend the concepts, challenges, good practices, and potential solutions to complex cross-cutting issue of gender-based discrimination. We will start our discussion with a dynamic exchange of questions and answers. Each speaker will be asked to keep their interventions under 3 minutes maximum, after which we will read a few questions from the public. We will end this 45-minute session with a series of concrete and action-orientated recommendations to guide the future endeavours of UNESCO in fighting gender stereotypes and discrimination through its anti-racist efforts. So, without further ado, let us start with Dr. Robert Livingston, lecturer in public policy at Harvard University. So, Dr. Livingston, you are a social psychologist and your research focuses on psychological processes that underlie unconscious bias, as well as how biases impact organizational diversity, leadership, representation, and social justice. You also have extensive expertise on the intersectionality of race and gender. So my question for you is, how can we actively eliminate the wide diversity of pervasive biases and stereotypes at the root of all forms of discrimination, especially when they are extremely dissimilar for different groups? The floor is yours. You have 4 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephanie, and congratulations on your new appointment. That's quite an honor. I will start by saying that there is an important difference between stereotypes, prejudice, and discrimination. And I think those words are often used interchangeably. But stereotypes are beliefs, prejudice refers to feelings, and discrimination is actual behavior, decisions, actions that people take. And I think those differences will become more important when I talk about interventions. But I also think it's important to realize that different isms have common root causes. And it's important to diagnose the root cause in order to best understand viable solutions to attacking the problem. And so such root causes often include structural elements. These are institutions, laws, practices, history of discrimination against women or people of color or people of different religions or ethnicities or social class, whatever the social distinction happens to be in a given society. There are also psychological components that we as human beings are wired, as you mentioned. There's a lot of work on unconscious bias that shows that, we categorize people by certain exterior traits or certain relevant social dimensions within a society, and that then leads to beliefs and assumptions about those individuals. But I want to stress that there's a really important motivational component as well. So we have a structural component, we have the cognitive component, but we also have a motivational component. And what that means is, in all cases of oppression or discrimination, there is a motivation or a need to dominate one group. In other words, at the root of all isms is power and an individual need for power or desire to obtain power. And I think if we sort of address that, then we get at the heart of oppression. In terms of interventions, I think there are three broad categories that people can adopt to address racism, sexism, or any other ism. Those are interventions at the individual level that are looking at changing individual hearts and minds. Then there are individuals or interventions that look at the cultural level. So how do we modify social norms around what is acceptable or unacceptable, what is considered to be praiseworthy or shameworthy. So I think to the extent that we can modify informal rules around how people should and should not behave, that has a tremendous downstream impact on behaviors. And then finally, there are changes to policies, practices, laws, and institutions. So we've got institutional level change where leaders, government can actually change formal rules, right? So social norms are about informal rules of propriety. Institutional changes are about formal rules around what is permissible and what is not. And I think once you get an alignment between individual factors, cultural factors, and institutional factors, you can really start making change on these fronts.
Thank you very much, Dr. Livingston. So we heard about stereotypes, discrimination, and the important differences between the two, and important to diagnose the root cause. We also heard you speak of the three broad categories of intervention for isms, including cultural and modifying those social norms. So thank you very much for that. So let me turn to Silvana Koch-Merin, President and founder of Women Political Leaders. So Silvana, you founded a global network of female politicians. You seek to increase both the number and the influence of women in political leadership and decision-making positions to foster positive change in this male-dominated field. You believe in optimizing communication, connection, and community. Could you tell us more? And in turn, what are the barriers that still impede on women's and girls' leadership and the upholding of gender equality? Why and how can we fix this issue? So the floor is yours and you have 4 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Also from me, huge congratulations on your recent appointment. That is fantastic. And I'm wishing you all the very best for this. So these questions that you put to me, they of course are very hard to answer in 4 minutes. But let me just start by kind of making us all think about the fact that in this pandemic, relatively speaking, the countries that are led by women, for example, New Zealand, Iceland, and others, are relatively speaking doing better than countries led by men. And currently we've got 93% of the countries around the world led by men. So let's just imagine a world where it would be 50-50, where half of the countries would have female leadership. What situation would the world be in this pandemic? Just a short mental exercise, because currently, if people around the globe close their eyes and think president, prime minister, the likelihood of that a female face appears is very, very low. And while there are plenty of individual stories, narratives, experiences around these stereotypes that one faces in leadership, when political leaders set out to try to measure this, to measure to what extent are prejudices still part of society when it comes to looking at the suitability for leadership of men and women across more than 20 sectors. So 3 years ago, together with Kantar, we started the Reykjavik Index for Leadership, which measures exactly that: how much prejudice, how much kind of differentiation in thinking is a man or a woman suitable for a position of leadership exists still. We measured the G7 countries plus Nigeria, Kenya, and India. And we also came to that by saying, only what matters gets measured. So the fact that there was no data on this also is a bit of a story. So in this data that we collected across those countries, we can see that there is still quite a way to go. If one would get to a score of 100, it would mean it doesn't matter if you're a man or woman. What matters is your qualification. It doesn't matter if you're kind of from what gender you are. But G7 average currently is at 73. And if we look at other countries, within G7, Canada is doing best with 81, and my home country, Germany, is doing the worst with 63, which is surprising in a way after so many years of very strong female leadership in that country. However, other countries outside the G7 are doing even worse. And in that, women and men are both complicit. There's a small difference in that, saying that men have a stronger prejudice towards who is a leader, if it's a man or a woman, than women do. But we also see an age difference, and what's a bit concerning is that the group of the youngest participants, specifically men there, 18 to 25, is the ones which has the highest degree of prejudices. So why we need to fix this? This was one of your questions. Well, first of all, it's a human right that humans, no matter which gender you are, you have equal access to opportunities for your life, for your careers. And it shouldn't be a determining factor which gender you are if these opportunities are open to you. So it's a basic human right, and we need to act on this. So how to fix it? Now that's the more challenging one, of course. And let me just start by saying it's not fixing itself. We've seen in politics that while there's been hardly any country not allowing women to the same degree the political participation, there is still a long, long way to go. We've done a study together with Yale University and London School of Economics a couple of years ago, which shows that there are 4 factors keeping women disadvantaged. And it's the same like in business. It's the traditional place of the woman, it's access to finance, it's how to combine work and family life, and maybe for public leaders specifically, the extent of bias in public perception, and also the violence that women in public leadership face significantly. So let me end by saying 3 things. What to do: first, ditch all the laws that treat women differently. It's important to make it clear that it's policy, that it's legislation to treat all countries equally. Currently, it's less than 20 countries in the world that treat women equally as per law. Then secondly, be data-driven. Look at indices, look at reports, look at analysis to make a strong point. And thirdly, do all those things that are already there, but do them more and stronger. Role models, sponsoring, networking, speaking up, taking action, and also provide the right finance and infrastructure to have this kind of data and reports that are necessary to make the case. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you. So we heard that countries led by women have done better in response to COVID under strong female leadership. It's a human right that we have equal access to opportunities that are available, and this should not be dependent on your gender. And amongst many of the tools to fix it, ditch the laws that treat women differently. So thank you very much for that, Silvana. So I would like now to turn to Ms. Trish Shetty, CEO of She Says and President of the Steering Committee of the Paris Peace Forum. Trish, you are a social activist and lawyer from India. Your organization notably works for gender equality through youth and civic society engagement. So my question for you is, how can we meaningfully mobilize societies, and especially the youth, to take action for gender equality and tackle gender and racist stereotypes? Trish, the floor is yours, and you also have 4 minutes. Thank you.
At the offset, thank you, Gabriella, for bringing us all together and recognizing the urgency of this conversation and topic. And I wish we could have Jenny in person, but Grovizu Jenny.
We're seeing Jenny there. Welcome, Jenny.
You know, to address your question, I often take umbrage at the phrasing of the question, because the idea is that we're not doing enough to mobilize young people, not recognizing that young people are already mobilizing, self-mobilizing, with little to no support from institutions, apart from institutions opening their doors to tokenization of young people to make them look good. I have never really seen, and I will say this boldly, even within like the highest offices of, even on the 36th floor of the UN in New York, I've never really seen the kind of meaningful participation that young people need. When we say, how do we mobilize young people? Well, I will tell you right now, in India, we have the largest protest in human history currently underway, led by farmers. 250 million people have been on the streets for over 3 months, protesting against the corporatization of farming industry, and also how the government is not listening to them. Now, the intersection of this protest is really interesting. There was a girl called Nodeep Kaur, young 24-year-old Dalit activist, who is a labor activist. After COVID, a lot of factories shut down and they were not paying their laborers. So what she did is she would show up with these laborers outside these institutions and demand that they get paid their salary so they can live a life of dignity. Because we often forget that people want to live a life of dignity. No one wants to live of charity, you see. What happened was she got arrested and she was allegedly beaten up and sexually violated in police custody. At the same intersection, climate activists started lending their support for this farmer protest movement because they realized that if you don't bring on board farmer concerns, if you double down on investing further in corporates like Adani and Ambani, you're going to affect the climate movement in a negative way. What happened? There was a young girl, I believe 21-year-old girl called Disha Ravi, who was arrested for being part of a toolkit that Greta Thunberg shared on how people, young people primarily, can mobilize and give their support to the farmer movement and protest. The young girl had to present herself in jail, stand up for her own rights, and say, if speaking up in defense of farmers is sedition, makes me a terrorist, then I'm better off in jail. We have Assad Traoré, not to go too far away, I'm in France, we have Assad Traoré, who is constantly mobilizing, fighting for justice for her brother, but she's never given room in places. She's looked at as radical, militant, or disruptive. So to answer the question, young people are very much mobilizing. What we want and are obsessed with is sanitized rooms, right? Every time I'm invited to speak, they tell me, oh, speak about gender inequality, but not about the abuse, not about rape. Don't tell us too much about the discrimination people are facing, because everyone wants sanitized conversations to feel good, address the issues, but yet make me feel good. As the oppressor, I still need to feel comfortable. Don't make me too uncomfortable. And young people don't know how to be differential, because young people are not obsessed with the idea of having a seat at the table and holding on to the seat at the table. For them, having a seat at the table means being disruptive and fighting for the rights of them and their people that's not been addressed at the table. So to answer the question of how do we mobilize, they're already mobilizing themselves. They're using social media. They're showing incredible solidarity. When Disha Ravi got arrested, when Nodeep Kaur got arrested, when people are fighting for Breonna Taylor in America, they are not waiting for institutions, respectfully, like the UN or member states to speak up in defense. They're showing solidarity amongst themselves because they know these institutions have inherently failed them. So they are mobilizing. What we can do is use our platforms to provide them with protection. Because this work is not easy. It guarantees you being arrested, being villainized on social media, and at best being killed, or your family being targeted. So what we can and must do, if we're serious about the conversation of equality, of ending racism, of ending discrimination, is go after the money of people who are invested in this, because this is a profitable industry. Racism and discrimination very much makes money. And second, protect the people on the front lines, primarily the young people who are doing the God's work for us. And third, this is the conversation that Gabriela and I had, is quotas. You need quotas, you need affirmative action. And I remember, Gabriela, someone asking you about quotas, and I would love for you to jump in here if you can, about what you said. And they often hesitate about meritocracy, but what about meritocracy? But if you see all these rooms of leadership positions, they're white old men. Don't talk to me about meritocracy when these people are holding leadership positions, right? It's mediocrity at best. So I think these are the three solutions, and I'm sorry I'm giving you the baton, Gabriela, but we had a really interesting conversation about this.
No, probably just to chip in on what Trisha is saying, we were saying that quotas make people feel uncomfortable, but it's the only thing that works. and we can have some incompetent men or incompetent women either way, but it's not for sure yet that you will have not merit-based quotas.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Tricia and Gabriella. So we heard that young people are already very mobilized, that young people are not waiting for institutions that have inherently failed them to mobilize. They're using tools such as social media to bring about change. So thank you very much for that, Tricia. So now, last but not least, I'm pleased to introduce you to Dra Zanuba Afria Shafsoa Rahman Waheed, Director of the Waheed Foundation. So, Yani, you are a social and political activist for tolerance and peace. You work on issues of anti-terrorism and anti-radicalism, as well as gender equality and empowerment of marginalized women. I would like to ask you, what institutional structures, including legal and cultural frameworks and policies, can contribute to counter gender stereotypes and discrimination against women, and how? The floor is yours, and you have 4 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephanie. And I'd like to also say to you, congratulations on your recent achievement, and I'm sure that you'll bring great energy into the new positions. And I would like also to give a shout out to my two favorite girls out there, Gabriella and Trish. And I think they provided a perfect segue into what I was going to say, actually. I mean, they already mentioned it about the affirmative action, about quotas. And I think from our experience here in my country, I think this is the most efficient way to counter gender imbalances in the society. Especially in the area that Silvana is actively involved in political representations. We need affirmative action to lower the barrier of entry for women towards leadership position. And we've got in Indonesia, for example, we've got 30% of quotas for women representation in Indonesia in political arena. And of course, it doesn't translate into a 30% parliamentary elect members, female members, but and the number that came out, it's actually lower than that, especially after the first few years after the policy was being introduced, and we've got 18% of women in the parliament, and then the next election it increased into 21% of elected women officials. So it's a gradual increase of representation once you get the quota. Because several studies suggest, and I think Dr. Livingston also mentioned that about the cognitive component of some of the hindrance to women joining several strategic positions. There are two constraints that women face, the external and the internal constraints that led to the poor representation of women in public office and boardrooms, as well as in science and mechanical fields. For example, the reluctance to compete, the unwillingness to take risk, as well as fear of being judged. These examples are cited as some internal constraint faced by a majority of women that led to a lower level of representation of women in certain strategic positions. The external factors often cited are stereotyping, patriarchal culture, gender bias during interview, to name a few. And so we need to have a system of quota to enabling women to have access to these positions, because it will pave the way for the next generations who hopefully will see these women there as an inspiration and also representations of the gender. Some critics might say that these women will be seen as a symbol of tokenism and will not begin to be given real responsibilities as a way to really contribute to the field. But I would argue that short-term solution will enable the next generation of women to participate through their own merits. And several studies suggest that women are more likely to get promoted in organizations where senior executives are female. Also, the productivity of female workers have been shown to increase under female managers and leaders. So The second point that I'd like to make, when it comes to gender discrimination and violence, is that that all of these cases often happen on community level. So we need to create participative policies that can answer these challenges on that level and provide legal framework to protect women from harassment, as well as help advancing their needs, especially on the lower level of the society. So what we do in my organization, for example, through a Peace Village initiative, this is our initiative that we developed together with the UN Women, is we facilitate villages to produce their own village action plans to help counter gender discrimination and using 3 different components, cross-sectors approaches. The first one is economic empowerment. The second one is a training on peace building. And the third one is women empowerment. We also help to facilitate a dynamic in which it is mandatory for the village to have a woman representatives in the village council. So a village to be able to join this Peace Village initiative, they have to adhere to certain conditions. And one of them is that the voices of the women are being heard. So there are 3 elements that are being used: prevention, protection, and empowerment. We also provide training for capacity building for the villages, for the task force in the village that starts to create that action plan. So that's an example of how we try to break through the barriers of institutional barriers that create some of the problems in the first place. So thank you.
Thank you, Jenny. So a gradual increase of representation once you have quotas, and a system of quotas will pave the way for the next generation of women to participate through their own merit. Thank you very much to all our panelists for that contribution. Now that we've had the first round of dynamic exchanges with our distinguished speakers, I would like to turn to the question and answer segment of our panel session. I would like to invite members of the audience to please send in your questions by typing them in the Q&A box on the Zoom platform. As we are welcoming audiences from around the world, we will therefore not be able to answer all the questions. We will, however, take them into account and as ideas and reflections to feed into the development of the UNESCO Anti-Racism and Anti-Discrimination Roadmap. So let us start firstly with a question. And the question is, how can we optimize a collaborative and intersectional approach in promoting the leadership of women who face racism and tackling the biases and stereotypes at the roots of all forms of discrimination? Who would like to go first?
Maybe I can chip in.
Silvana, Jenny.
Maybe.
Okay, thank you.
Let me chip in while our speakers warm up. I think a wonderful place to start, because we are in the house of UNESCO, is to eliminate stereotypes from textbooks. And then teachers will need to learn also to avoid the stereotype and biases included in these definitions. But they really impinge every activity of human, of us humans, so it needs to go deep down in many other sectors. So, anybody?
Thank you very much. Anyone? Tricia?
Dr. Robert is...
Dr. Livingston?
Yeah.
I'm also happy.
I think Dr. Livingston raised his hand first.
Dr. Livingston.
Yeah.
Sure, and I'll be quick and we can get to other respondents. I've done research that research has shown that there are at least 3 different types of social disadvantage. And in order to be able to optimally address discrimination, it's important to be attuned to the nuance. And very quickly, those 3 types are stigmatization, subordination, and marginalization. And depending on the intersectionality of the group, some are more likely to experience one versus the other. So for example, our research has shown that Black men tend to be stigmatized. Stigmatization is characterized by negative perceptions and a high level of vigilance. So this would be like the proverbial scarlet letter. This is a group that sticks out to society and they stick out in a negative way. Subordination is really subduing a group so that they have a low position of power, but it may or may not be characterized by negative feelings. So this could be, a relationship traditionally between parents and children, where there's clear expectations about who should have the power and who shouldn't have the power. And a lot of research on benevolent sexism, at least, has shown that a lot of relationships between dominant group men and dominant group women tends to be characterized by subordination, and that it only becomes hostile when women, quote unquote, stop assuming the traditional role. And then there's this element of marginalization, which, by the way, subordination often is characterized by a high level of interdependence between dominance and subordinate groups. But in the case of marginalization, there's a complete indifference and invisibility. So unlike stigma that's characterized by negative perceptions and subordination in which there's an active attempt to subdue, with marginalization, there's a complete apathy and indifference for the group. So this would be similar to attitudes towards the Native communities in the United States, that they're just invisible. And research has found that, for example, Black women tend to be marginalized, whereas Black men are stigmatized and Black women are subordinated. All three are negative, but research has shown that understanding the nuance in the dynamics between those three types of social disadvantage can really tailor interventions designed to eradicate them.
Thank you very much. So just taking another question from the audience. So how do we address the lack of regional diversity when we talk about gender parity and equal representation in international organizations? Who would like to answer that one? Thank you, Silvana.
If I may, it's the same answer that Jenny gave, I think, already for the parliamentary composition, that a system of quota, of very active approach on both if it's a woman or man, or if from which region, so that the geographical balance is kept, is needed. Again, it's not something that fixes itself, and it only is happening if it's really actively pursued and made a policy. So for this to happen, the question that you asked before, I think is crucial, and this sort of collaborative approach and also the intersectoral approach, because there needs to be a huge understanding that this is what's needed and this is what needs to happen. And so at Women Political Leaders, we try to collaborate with women politicians from all geographies across all party lines to be truly non-partisan, but have the same very mission to bring more women into politics. And this needs to happen, of course, also then much broader if we talk about this geographical differences that still exist. And what Tricia was saying about the power of social media in terms of collaboration and across sectors and obviously across geographies, I think that is a very, very important tool that will certainly develop even more so. And we've seen just in the past few years the power of movements like Me Too or also BLM, and how this really gained the momentum and the support through social media. And there are many others that I'm not naming here, and this is not because I find them less important, not at all, but just to name some which through this power of collaboration and also giving voice to people who might not sit at these famous decision-making tables and who can be very voiceful and powerful. So wanted to add that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Silvana. So thank you all very much for your incredibly enriching answers. To keep to time, let us move to the last part of this session, and that is your concrete recommendations to UNESCO. Remember, our question is, how can we promote a gender-transformative approach to fighting stereotypes, prejudices, and discriminations? And with this in mind, what do you suggest UNESCO does and takes into consideration in its upcoming work against racism and all forms of discrimination, especially gender-based discrimination, stereotyping and violence? And of course, we heard a little bit about this before, but you each have 90 seconds to answer. So let's start with Tricia. Thank you.
Thank you. You know, at the offset, leadership makes a difference. And not just leadership, but who's part of your team. It definitely makes a difference. And what I've seen is even in institutions that show intentionality when it comes to being inclusive, they still have old leadership positions that are held on to people who are insecure. They just want to give that one seat to that one token representation, but still want to keep it as things were before. So I genuinely think we need to clean house. You know, when we talk about housekeeping on Zoom, we need to do that also within institutions, because there's a joke within, you know, the UN spaces that you enter, you'll see the same person even 10 years later. It's probably gone from one institution to the other, but they still are revolving. And there is a deficit of ambition when it comes to a lot of these spaces. So I think a sort of housekeeping. And secondly, I'll go back to having conversations centered around people whose lives are at the end of the data that we so easily and readily spout. We need to center our conversations by those people who are most affected and then do everything we can to protect them.
Thank you. Dr. Livingston.
So great. I loved that last answer, and I want to echo on what Tricia just said. And in fact, I just wrote a book that came out last month in February called The Conversation, How Seeking and Speaking the Truth About Racism Can Radically Transform Individuals and Organizations. And in it, I pretty much lay out a 3-stage process: education, conversation, action, in that order. So I think one of the things that UNESCO can do is provide education, an accurate portrayal of history and contribution of people from traditionally marginalized, stigmatized, and subordinated groups. I think it's important that the general public know, and many people don't know, many people don't want to know, but many people actually don't know about the invaluable contributions that have been made. And I think education can play a really key role in helping people understand not just the history, but the role of their own biases, the role of current structures in determining the differences that they see. Otherwise, people are likely to misattribute any sort of disparities to inherent incompetencies or lack of ability of people of subordinated groups. I think it's important for people to talk about it. As humans, we are innately social creatures, and social relationships provide a portal for facts to enter. So just raw data isn't enough. I think you have to leverage relationships so that people actually receive and digest the information. And then finally, I think it's important to have a plan of action, and not just something vague that many companies have, which is, let's do something. In fact, I've had leaders tell me, you know, I know we should be doing something, but I don't know what, and I don't understand the problem. I think it's important for people to get a very concrete understanding of what the issues are and how to develop a strategy, a specific strategy, an actionable strategy to address those issues.
Thank you, Robert. Jenny.
Thank you. I think my recommendation would be for UNESCO to build alliances that goes beyond formal institutions, but also reaching out to informal institutions. So not just addressing the issues or trying to work with governments, countries, or educational institutions, but also cultural clubs, various religious groups, etc., youth groups, like Tricia recommended. And also what Dr. Livingston said, work with educational institutions is one of the key things. But also the second thing that that I recommend would be to not to work in silos. Stephanie, you mentioned earlier in your preface that many of the issues regarding gender discrimination actually overlaps with other issues like race discriminations, and in the context of my country, for example, it's a cultural conservatism or religious conservatism. So we need to work with various groups that are trying to address these issues using different kind of incentives as well. So not just working on the issue of gender discriminations alone, but trying to incorporate many different kind of incentives to get people, mobilize people into action. So that will be my recommendation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jenny. Silvana.
Thank you very much. There's very little to add. It's been so comprehensive and rich answers already. So I'm trying to add one element as a recommendation for UNESCO, in addition to everything that's been said, which I fully endorse and sign up to. And that would be maybe that to promote a policy, a culture of apology and true truth-seeking, which, especially in the cultural and educational context, is something needed. It's been happening partially in some political environments where an apology can set off a very, very important development for seeking different perspectives and truth and having a very new development or new start. And I think in the cultural educational context, that could be also a valuable element to add. Thank you.
Stephanie?
Thank you very much, Sil.
Before you conclude, Stephanie, let me say that this has been a fantastic panel, and I want to finish it with a positive comment. I think that we have heard from all these champions, starting with you, the first female with the Law Society, great. Patricia heading this fantastic fight for equality, and Jenny and Robert, and of course Silvana. I mean, we all know Silvana on the legal framework. I think that we should document how much institutions, countries, and places that have better gender representation and more diversity perform better. That's a fact. We perform better when we are diverse. We perform better when we have different voices. And therefore, I would like to say that besides all what I've heard from every one of you what you want UNESCO to do, and that's why you were invited, I would make a point to really push forward the positive and the inspirational that you all are providing in seeing why these institutions work better, because you're there. So thank you so much. We have got a lot of very good ideas that we will follow through. So, Stephanie.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Gabriella. Just to say, I will actually be the 6th female, the 177th, and the first person of color, or am president. I'm still getting used to my new title. So thank you very much to everyone, to the panel. It's been an enriching conversation. We heard about giving the voiceless a voice. We genuinely need to clean house. Tricia, I absolutely like that. To ensure diversity becomes the norm. And Robert, how seeking and speaking the truth about racism, your new book, can radically transform individuals and can lead to change through education, conversation, and action. Jenny, we heard about building alliances that go beyond formal alliances, and Silvana, to promote a culture of truth-seeking. So I will now give the floor to Ms. Tania de Montaigne, a renowned French writer, author, and musician, who will take you away for a few minutes with excerpts from her latest works before the 4th and last panel of the day. Without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, Ms. Tania de Montaigne. Thank you.
De vous à moi. J'étais vous et j'étais moi. J'étais d'ici, mais vous me vouliez là-bas. À chaque décennie, on inventait des mots pour me dire, pour me raconter, pour dire qui j'étais. Depuis quelque temps déjà, mon nom était diversité. J'étais un genre issu de la diversité. On disait issu comme si la diversité était un ventre gigantesque, une matrice géante qui, à intervalles réguliers, donnait des sens à des gens comme moi, des gens divers. Ou bien comme si la diversité était un pays, un lieu lointain où vivraient des gens spéciaux, des gens qui parleraient une langue spéciale, le divers, et qui auraient des coutumes et des mœurs particulières. Un nouveau pays, donc, dont je n'avais pas le passeport, mais visiblement, ça n'avait aucune importance. Le passeport, c'était ma peau, ou l'idée qu'on se faisait de ma peau. Le passeport, c'était mon corps, ou l'idée qu'on se faisait de mon corps. Par exemple, on disait que j'avais une tête d'arabe, une gueule de métèque, un nez de noir, un nez de juif, une gueule d'asiatique, une face de protestant, un air de gitan. On disait tout sauf l'essentiel. On ne disait pas que j'étais d'ici. Surtout pas. Non, moi, on me voulait là-bas. J'étais la personne qui avait des origines. On disait origine, en détachant chaque syllabe. 4 syllabes. Origine. Certains trouvaient ça formidable. Ils disaient « J'adore les gens qui ont des origines ». D'autres répondaient « Oui, moi aussi, hein, je trouve ça formidable, les gens qui ont des origines ». Apparemment, les gens qui aimaient les gens qui avaient des origines, eux, n'avaient pas d'origine. Souvent, ces mêmes personnes disaient aussi « J'aime les gens de couleur ». Ils le disaient en collant bien chaque mot pour n'en faire plus qu'un « gens de couleur », en un seul mot. Apparemment, les gens qui aimaient les gens de couleur n'avaient pas de couleur. Apparemment, seuls les gens de couleur avaient une couleur. C'est même à ça qu'on les reconnaissait. Quelle couleur? Ça n'était pas précisé. Il convenait également de noter que seuls les gens de couleur avaient une origine. Quelle origine? Ça n'était pas précisé. On disait aussi « J'adore les gens de couleur, ils sont une telle richesse pour notre pays ». J'étais donc une richesse de couleur avec des origines. J'étais l'ami musulman, comme dans la phrase « Tu sais, j'ai un ami musulman, il est très sympa ». J'étais l'ami noir, comme dans la phrase « Moi, j'ai un ami plus noir qu'un musulman et crois-moi, il est vraiment sympa ». J'étais l'ami juif, comme dans « J'ai un ami plus juif qu'un noir musulman et c'est pas pour me vanter, mais il est au-delà du sympa ». J'étais l'ami homosexuel, comme dans « J'ai une amie plus homosexuelle qu'un juif musulman, noir, gitan, protestant, d'origine asiatique et ça m'étonnerait que tu trouves quelqu'un de plus sympa ». J'étais diverse et variée en un seul corps, une seule voix, un seul regard. Pourtant, j'étais vous et j'étais moi. J'étais sommée d'être à un endroit et de n'en pas bouger. J'étais sommée de me taire ou pressée de parler. J'avais des sujets qui m'étaient désignés. On me disait « Tu veux sûrement nous parler de l'esclavage ?» Non. On me disait « Ne nous ferais-tu pas une petite démonstration de karaté ?» Non. On me disait « Si tu le sens, n'hésite pas à nous jouer quelque chose de ton pays. » Non. Pourtant, j'étais vous et j'étais moi. J'étais d'ici, mais vous me vouliez là-bas. D'ailleurs, au moment des élections, on me disait « Toi qui as des origines, ne serait-il pas temps que tu retournes dans ton pays ?» Quel pays? Ça n'était pas précisé. Mais dès qu'une échéance électorale pointait son nez, j'étais convoquée. On me disait « On est chez nous ». On me disait « Retournez chez vous ». On me parlait au pluriel, car je n'étais pas une, mais plusieurs. Je n'étais pas un, mais tous. J'étais une masse compacte. J'étais supposée tout savoir du groupe auquel on m'avait assigné, puisque j'étais le groupe à moi seule. Chez nous n'était pas chez moi. Pourtant, j'étais vous et j'étais moi. Vous me vouliez perpétuellement de passage, toujours en transit, une valise dans une main, un billet d'avion dans l'autre. Vous me vouliez à jamais sur le départ. J'étais le triangle rouge, l'étoile jaune, la lanterne rouge, le point noir, l'angle mort. À la scène, qu'il disait, à la scène, avec un fusil, une matraque, à main nue, faites comme vous voulez, mais qu'il n'en reste plus un. À la scène. J'étais vous et j'étais moi. J'étais un corps flottant dans le fleuve tranquille. J'étais celle que l'on passe par l'épée. J'étais l'homme à la gorge tranchée, se noyant dans les eaux profondes. J'étais la femme aux veines ouvertes. Mon sang rougissait les rues de Paris. Du rouge plein les trottoirs, les pavés et les murs. Les femmes et les enfants d'abord, qu'il n'en reste plus un. Du rouge, partout du rouge. J'étais la Saint-Barthélemy, j'étais les Huguenots, j'étais Drancy, le Veldiv, la Gégène, les camps de transit, les zones de stockage, les wagons plombés. J'étais le mauvais garçon, la méchante fille. À vos yeux, je représentais dans le même temps le joueur de flûte et le rat, le cafard, la vermine, le voleur de poules, le bruit et l'odeur, qu'il n'en reste plus un. J'étais le frère et l'ennemi, j'étais la sœur et la traîtresse, j'étais l'impossible, j'étais le fantasme et la réalité. du rouge, partout du rouge, qu'il n'en reste plus un. Quand venaient les grandes peurs, on me convoquait pour mieux me chasser. J'étais le mal nécessaire, le lest, la bouffée d'oxygène. J'étais la sorcière promise au bûcher, j'étais l'hérétique, le poison, la peste et le choléra, le danger à l'état liquide, celle qu'on ne voit pas et celui qu'on voit trop. J'étais le désir et l'effroi. J'étais le passé toujours incandescent et j'étais l'avenir toujours effrayant. Pour moi, pas de présent. Pour moi, pas d'ici et maintenant. Pour moi, c'était toujours là-bas et plus tard, quand je serais meilleure, quand je serais parfaite, quand je serais un ange. J'étais sommée d'être angélique. Je n'avais pas le droit à l'erreur. À vos yeux, j'étais l'erreur. Pourtant, j'étais vous et j'étais moi. J'étais une cellule, un atome, j'étais de l'eau et de l'air, j'étais de la chair et des os, de la sueur et du muscle, du sang et des larmes, des viscères, des canaux, des artères, des réseaux, des cavités, des pulsations, des battements, des zones sèches, d'autres humides, des sons et des silences. J'étais complexe et multiple. J'étais vous et j'étais moi. J'étais un être humain, imparfait, roseau pensant, milieu de deux infinis, les pieds sur terre, la tête en l'air. J'étais forte et vulnérable. Je n'étais pas plus bête qu'un autre, mais pas plus intelligent non plus. Je n'étais pas merveilleuse, pas fantastique. Je n'étais pas diabolique, pas surpuissant. J'étais ordinaire, banale, une Française moyenne, un Français moyen.
Thank you.